When people ask me why I left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's no simple answer, as there was no single reason or issue. During the next 5 minutes, I'll try to sum up my experience as concisely as possible for those who are interested. At about 5 minutes and 10 seconds, I present a challenge to believers, and for the final 5 minutes, I provide a few footnotes to this video. The decision to leave the church was not easy or quick. Instead, it was a long 4-year process of prayer, study, sacrament attendance, temple attendance, and asking a lot of questions from faithful friends and leaders. I spent a lot of time doubting my doubts, but then I began to doubt my doubts of my doubts. Before I started going crazy, I had to stop and ask myself, 1, is it possible that the church is not true? Well, I had to answer yes, it was possible. There are people all over the world who are members of and believe very strongly in organizations that aren't what they claim to be. Number 2, if it weren't true, would I want to know? Clearly, the answer here was yes. And number 3, if it weren't true, how would I know? Well, this question was tricky. I assumed if the church wasn't true, it would be obvious, that I would have discovered it a long time ago. But then again, there are people who are fully committed to belief systems that to us seem obviously false. What if I was living one, and I didn't know it? J. Reuben Clark, first counselor in the First Presidency, once said, "If we have the truth, it cannot be harmed by investigation. And if we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed." So I set out to investigate the truth claims of the church. I believed the church was true and that it could not be harmed. I also believed it would pass the test and I would come out the other side even stronger than before. Gordon B. Hinckley once said, "Well, it's either true or false. If it's false, we're engaged in a great fraud. If it's true, it's the most important thing in the world." I decided to leave no stone unturned. I would consider all evidence from all possible sources and thus began a 4-year journey and hundreds of hours of study, research, and pondering. During this time, I tried to come up with some kind of methodology to organize all the information I was gathering. I began to think of sort of a standard distribution of evidence, something like this, ranging from -10 on the left to +10 on the right, with 0 in the middle. On the right, greater than 0, I would place evidences supporting the church's truth claims. On the left, less than 0, I would place items that either disproved or were contradictory to the church's claims. The stronger the evidence for or against, the higher or lower it would rank on the scale. Any evidence that was neither for nor against, I could place it right in the middle at 0. Anytime I came across a piece of information, I would stop and ask myself, would a neutral third party, someone who had nothing to do with the LDS Church, place this on the left or the right side of the scale? There were 2 types of evidences that I would come across. I'll call them quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative items were things that could be measured and tested, scientifically. A few examples might be Native American DNA, the Book of Abraham translation, or Book of Mormon archaeology. The other type was qualitative. It was sort of a judgment call or gut feeling. I would ask myself, is this what you would expect to see if the church were true and led by prophets? Here's an example. Church leaders continue to practice polygamy after the manifesto. This sort of deceit was not something that you would expect to see from inspired leaders of Christ's true church. So I would have placed that at less than 0. A few more examples of qualitative items. Joseph Smith marrying a 14-year-old. Joseph Smith marrying other men's wives. 150 years of denying African Americans the blessings of the temple. Building a $3 billion shopping mall. For 4 years I did this, item after item, and every time, at best, I was able to place it in the neutral spot. But more often than not, I had to rank it negative. I struggled to think of anything to place on the right side. When I finally stepped back and looked at the whole picture, 99.9% of all evidence was pointing that the church was not true. Let me repeat that. After hundreds of hours of studying, I struggled to come up with any evidence that was measurable, observable, that was unique to the LDS Church, that a neutral third party would concede should be placed on the positive side of the scale. Christ said, "By their fruit you shall know them." But if this was Christ's true church, where was all the fruit? Why was the scale so skewed false? When I started out, I wasn't expecting to find overwhelming evidence in favor for the church. I knew that the church couldn't be proven true. Otherwise, there would be no need for faith. I figured at best I would see 50-50, a sort of perfect balance of neutrality. And at worst, maybe 60-40, to make the faith part a little bit more challenging. Had I found that, I would likely still be a member today. However, what I found was that 99.9% of all observable and measurable evidence was against the church. I never would have expected that result prior to this 4-year journey. Sure, I had doubts, but I believed when I started that I would find the church validated at the bottom of the rabbit hole. I fully expected to find strong, compelling evidence on the right side of the scale, but I did not, and I began to wonder if there's anything that a neutral party would place on the right side. So that's the challenge to any believers out there. Name something that is measurable, quantitative, or observable, qualitative, that is unique to the LDS Church, that a neutral third party would concede should be placed on the positive side of the scale, meaning that it supports the church's truth claims. Footnote number 1. Why did I make this video? Essentially, I made this video because trying to explain my position to believers is extremely tedious. Too often we get bogged down on debating for hours the merits of any one piece of evidence. I wanted to easily and quickly illustrate that it's no one piece of evidence. Instead, it's the overwhelming weight of hundreds of pieces of evidence against, and at the same time, the shocking absence of any evidence for. Too often I think believers assume if they've heard about 4 or 40 items on the left, they've heard it all. However, there is far more than I had ever imagined, and I only scratched the surface. Also, I think believers assume that there's a lot of evidence in favor for the church, which is why I wanted to put forth this challenge. Footnote number 2, theology. A lot of believing members have tried to offer theological reasons why the church is true. I will be addressing the problems of using theology as evidence in a later video. For the challenge here, though, I'm looking for tangible, measurable, observable evidence. Footnote number 3, rankings. For my purposes here, I wasn't as much interested in nailing down the exact values, as those tend to be subjective and vary from person to person. For example, some consider the translation of the Book of Abraham to be a smoking gun, while others don't. I'm more interested in what side of the equation it falls on, less than 0 or greater than 0 or neutral. Footnote number 4, neutral third party. I know what some people are thinking. No one can truly be a neutral third party, therefore no one will ever rank anything greater than 0 on the scale and give any credence to the church's claims. But let me give you a few quick examples of why I disagree with this. Let's consider, for example, Nostradamus. I, for one, and probably most of the viewers of this video, do not believe that Nostradamus had any supernatural ability to see or predict the future. However, in the 1500s, Nostradamus seems to have accurately predicted the rise and power of Hitler. He talks about Western Europe, seducing with his tongue, and even goes on to name him Histler. So close. On the surface, this would appear to be evidence that Nostradamus was in fact prophetic. And me being a neutral third party, I would place this on the right side of the scale. 2 more quick examples from religion. Let's take a look at the Seventh-day Adventists. Currently, they own and operate something like 47 nonprofit hospitals throughout the world. This is a great example of some qualitative fruit that I would expect to see if the Seventh-day Adventists were in fact Christ's true church. The Salvation Army runs 6,500 centers across the world that provide shelter, food, and clothing to those in need. These are both things that are unique to these organizations, and as a neutral party, I would say are evidential that they could be the true church. Footnote number 5. Apologists. I read a lot of apologetics during this time. I wasn't particularly interested in what some Mormon apologist or BYU professor were putting forth because they start with the conclusion in mind. They're often fitting square pegs into round holes, offering the best possible spins on topics. Remember, I was looking for the opinion of neutral parties. I would have been willing to give these items presented by apologists some credence if they had been sort of validated by other neutral outside scholars, but I couldn't find any examples of that. I found that Mormon apologetics are 98% defensive, meaning they're focused on neutralizing evidences on the left side of the scale. They're rarely, if ever, putting forth positive evidences. Often I found the arguments of apologists so weak or convoluted that it actually helped to strengthen the validity of the original negative criticism. Footnote number 6, anti-Mormon lies. Many of the things I studied I had heard previously in my life as a believer. In the past, I was able to dismiss them as anti-Mormon lies. I was told that a lot of the information was either taken out of context or misinterpreted. I was surprised to learn that a lot of these things were not only factually true and well-documented events, but a lot of times they were corroborated by official church material. Many of the items discussed here in this video can be found in the Gospel Topics essays on the church's website. Footnote number 7, 2 things. I worked this exercise for 4 years because there were in fact 2 things on the right side of my scale. And those two things were able to hold back the tide of mounting evidence for quite some time. But eventually they collapsed under the pressure. I will be posting a video about those two things in weeks to come. Thanks for watching. Feel free to comment below if you can think of anything to place on the right side of the scale.